Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Bootcamp Webinar Short Course. Again, my name's Allegra Rockledge, for those of you joining us for the first time this week, and I'm with the Conservation Finance Network. We want to first of all say thank you to everyone who joined us on Tuesday for our first two sessions this week. We really appreciate all of your engagements, your many questions, and we really hope that the sessions on Tuesday sparked some ideas for you and that you'll find today's sessions even more engaging. So this is the third session in our Bootcamp webinar series. It's called Conservation Finance Opportunities with Public and Philanthropic Capital. And this session is going to highlight a range of new or underutilized ways to leverage public and philanthropic dollars for land and resource conservation. The formats for today's sessions are going to be a little bit different than Tuesdays. For these sessions, we're going to have 5 panelists on each, and each of the panelists is going to provide a short presentation that gives a broad overview of their work. So our goal for these sessions is just to introduce you to how some of the conservation finance tools and strategies that we introduced on Tuesday, like forest carbon markets or wetland mitigation, are being used by practitioners. So we'll also continue discussing new trends and developments and how these tools are being used. But the idea here is that we hope that this series of short presentations will just spark some new ideas for you, generate some questions, and hopefully give you the chance to learn from and follow up from our presenters if you have ideas on how to collaborate or want more information. A couple of logistics before we dive into this first webinar today. Again, I received many emails from folks, so I do want to remind you that these webinars are being recorded and they will be available on our website at a later date. However, they are just being offered live to applicants of the 2020 Bootcamp, as well as select CFN partners. We also want to remind you that participants are going to be kept on mute throughout the presentations. So if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and then we'll have time to answer them at the end of the session. So we'll just do a rapid fire set of presentations, and then we'll do all of the Q&A at the end. My colleague Leigh Whelpton at CFN is going to be moderating this session. So with that, I will hand it off to her to get us started.
Thanks, Allegra. Always got to remember to unmute yourself. And so, hi, folks. For those joining today, my name is Leigh Whelpton. I'm the Program Director of the Conservation Finance Network and your moderator for the session. I'm thrilled to be joined by a super strong panelist lineup today, which includes Will Abberger with the Trust for Public Land, Margaret Bowman with Spring Point Partners, Mark Heller with the Colorado Educational and Cultural Facilities Authority, one of my favorite acronyms, CECFA, Peter Howell with the Open Space Institute, and Alison Souders with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So if we do our job well, we hope you're going to walk away today with a deeper understanding of the different approaches being advanced by each of our panelists. We made a mention of a lot of these tools and techniques during Tuesday's evolution presentation, but now we're hoping to breathe a little more color and life into how and where these tools and programs plug into conservation finance projects or initiatives. Another thing that we hope you'll walk away with from today's session is a slight revision in how the field of conservation finance is contextualized. Very frequently in earlier literature and framing, including presentations and reports that the Conservation Finance Network put out, we've provided the following problem framing. Public and philanthropic resources are too small to address the scale of the problem. We need private capital and private investors to scale so that we can meet the challenge facing us all today. And while that's not false, technically remains true, it tends to obfuscate the critical role that public and philanthropic funds play in enabling private capital to come into conservation, let alone how those sources help to ensure that such projects and efforts conform to sound science and deliver tangible environmental and social outcomes. So with that framing in mind, the slight revised framing, if you will, Our panelists are going to showcase trends and approaches in ballot measures, in grant making, program-related and mission-aligned investing, green bonds, water funds, and federally enabled state-run green infrastructure financing. So this is going to be just phenomenal. And as a reminder to the panelists, we're going to give each of you 10 minutes for your remarks. I'll turn my video back on to give you a 2-minute warning, and then potentially we'll get less polite as you start to run over time, although we know that won't happen. And the whole point of that is to maintain a reservoir of time at the end of the session such that we can facilitate a little dialogue among and between panelists, and especially to make sure that we have time for open Q&A. So, Will, I'm going to pass things over to you to dive in and get us started. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Leigh, and thank you to the Conservation Finance Network and Yale for inviting the Trust for Public Land to be part of this expert panel. I'm really honored to be a part of it, and I'm here to talk to you today about the public funding portion of the title of the webinar today, and more particularly about questions that are placed before voters at the state and local level, asking them to dedicate funding for conservation. If you could go to the next slide, please, Allegra. So this is the question people ask: where does public funding for conservation come from? Next slide, please, Allegra. And in fact, the bulk of public funding for conservation in the United States today, nearly 80%, comes at the state and local level. And most of that is through voter-approved ballot measures. Next slide, please, Allegra. Oh, you went. Yeah, so this is a question, the big idea, and we believe pretty resoundingly, and our experience at the Trust for Public Land has been the answer is yes, particularly if voters are presented with a proposal that addresses compelling needs, is affordable, and is working with government officials they think they can trust. Next slide, please. So this graph is a little bit complicated, but the blue bars are basically the percent of state and local land conservation ballot measures that are approved by voters in any year. In other words, the passage rate. The gray graph line there you see is the total amount of public funding generated in any given year, and you see the amounts there as well. And what we've seen through changes in administrations in Washington, D.C., through crises in the past, whether it's the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. In 2001, or the last Great Recession starting in 2010, that this is an idea that's very appealing to voters in the United States, and that 3 out of every 4 ballot measures that's placed before voters asking them to dedicate funding for parks or conservation are approved, and that passage rate is held pretty steady. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, gee, what's happening now with COVID-19? And that was a big question for us as well. But if you go to the next slide, please, Leigh. Allegra, sorry. These are measures that have been on the ballot since, I guess, now what would be the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. You can see there are a variety of different jurisdictions around the country, some different finance mechanisms, but the point here is even in a time when the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are quite acute, voters are continuing to show strong support at the ballot box for parks and land conservation. Next slide, please, Allegra. And we're talking about real money here. 2014 was in fact a record year, and this chart doesn't quite bring us to present, but this is showing total dollars created in excess of 20 billion in new public funds created in 2014. That was primarily 2 very large statewide ballot questions, one in Florida and one in New Jersey, dedicating public funding constitutionally in those cases for parks and conservation in those states. The other thing that I would point out here quickly, and that you saw in the previous chart, is we tend to see more ballot measure activity and therefore larger amounts of funding being approved in general elections or even year elections, and that this chart shows that quite clearly. Next slide, please, Allegra. Just a couple of quick snapshots here of recent elections. This was the last general election last November, November 2018. There were 57 measures on the ballot, 49 of them were approved. That 86% passage rate actually exceeds the historic average of 76%, and nearly 3 billion, or a little bit more than 3 billion in new funds created for parks and conservation. Next slide, please, Allegra. Just looking at the last election that we had in our country, the November 5th election, which was an off-year election. As is typically the case, not quite as much ballot measure activity, but still quite a high passage rate. Obviously, this is all pre-COVID-19, but about 4.4 billion in new funds for parks and conservation approved. And a lot of that was in one measure. Voters in Texas were presented with a question to dedicate that portion of the state sales tax attributable to the sales of sporting goods to the Texas state conservation efforts, and that measure alone was around 3 billion in funding for conservation that will be generated. Next slide, please. So this gives you a look at where those ballot measures are happening around the country. Anything colored in green on this map is a statewide, county, or the green dots municipal ballot measure that's been approved by voters. The reddish or pink color here are ballot measures that have failed. And one thing I would point out about this map, you see a lot of activity in Florida, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, and in Colorado. Those are all states that also have a very strong state land conservation funding program that provides matching funds to local governments if they have their own voter-approved local funding. So for instance, in Massachusetts, which you see pulled out there to the side, under the state's Community Preservation Act, if your town votes to increase property taxes for conservation, you're guaranteed a dollar-for-dollar match from the state of Massachusetts. Next slide, please, Allegra. So the Trust for Public Land and our conservation finance program is very active in this arena of local and state ballot measures. We've been involved in over 570 successful state and local ballot measures around the country since 1996, creating about 80 billion in new funding for parks and conservation. And we've had the great good fortune to enjoy a passage rate of ballot measures that we support of 82%. And if you go to the next slide, Allegra, briefly, I can talk about why that is. And really, for us, the key is designing a ballot measure that's going to have the very best chance for success when it's presented to the voters. So the focus of our work at the Trust for Public Land and our conservation finance program is in ballot measure design. It starts with what we call feasibility research, which is fundamentally examining the sources of revenue or finance mechanisms that are available in a particular jurisdiction, how much funding they generate, and very importantly, the impact on taxpayers. We almost always want to do a poll of voters in the jurisdiction where we're testing a specific ballot question to understand whether it's viable or not, but also to understand a lot of other important factors like which uses for the funds are more compelling to voters, what kind of accountability measures should the proposal include, when should we put it on the ballot, and what should the amount be, very importantly. Based on what we learn in our feasibility research and the poll, we're then able to make a pretty well-informed recommendation about ballot measure design. We always call out the actual ballot language in our conservation finance methodology as a separate step. What you read when you're casting your ballot, either in the mail or at the voting booth on election day, or perhaps early voting. But ballot language does make a big difference. If left to the lawyers, you typically end up with something that's fairly unintelligible to the average voter, and being able to clearly communicate the proposal is key.
Well, this is just your friendly 2-minute warning.
Great, thanks so much, Leigh. So that's all about ballot measure design and getting the right measure on the ballot. We're also very engaged in ballot measure campaigns, much like any other political campaign. The obvious difference being we're seeking to dedicate funding for parks for conservation rather than elect an individual to office. Next slide, please, Leigh. So this is what we're looking at for the November 2020 presidential election. We're likely to see a lot less activity than we would typically see due to the economic impacts of COVID-19, particularly as we see those impacts playing out in state and local government budgets, which are quite drastic in many places. But nevertheless, these jurisdictions are all places that have already referred a measure to the ballot. We expect an equal number of additional measures to find their way to the ballot, if not more, over the next 30 to 60 days. And I would point out in particular, there at the very bottom of this chart, the New York environmental bonds proposed by Governor Cuomo and approved by the New York legislature. $3 billion, and much of that funding would be devoted to resiliency and natural climate solutions in New York State. One more, please, Allegra. So that wraps it up. I hope I've just given you a taste of the opportunities that are out there and the level of money and also the level of public support when voters are allowed to vote on dedicating funding for parks and conservation. And this is something you're interested in doing in your state or community, the Trust for Public Land and our Conservation Finance Program would love to work with you.
Thanks so much, Will. We're going to invite you back for the panel discussion, but in the meantime, we're going to pass things over to Margaret Bowman. Margaret, take it away.
Thanks, Leigh, and thanks to Allegra as well for setting this webinar up, and also thank you to Amy for all the logistics. Online logistics are hard, and I appreciate them. I work for Spring Point Partners, which is an LLC with a social impact mission, and that means that we blend both grant making and impact investing to drive social change. We aren't technically a foundation. We kind of serve similar to a foundation with an LLC structure, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I want to first describe how foundation philanthropic capital can be used for conservation finance. Allegra, can you go to the next slide? Which, by the way, is my only slide, so you get to look at this for a while. So foundations have three different ways that they can use their capital to drive change. The most traditional is through a grant and is directly focused on impact. It has a negative 100% return, though, from a financial standpoint. But the expectation is that the impact is very high, and obviously this is a major focus of foundations. Foundations are set up, before I go into the other two uses of foundation dollars, foundations are set up by a donor, and they give the money to a foundation. They get their tax write-off immediately when they establish the foundation. And so the IRS controls a fair amount of the rules on how foundation dollars can be used. A foundation is required to give away a minimum of 5% of their resources through grants and other impact-focused philanthropic activities. They're not mandated to only give away 5%, but often a lot of them manage towards that 5% target. The second way that the foundations can use their 5% allocation is through an investment that provides more than a negative 100% return from grants, but doesn't provide a market rate return. So a program-related investment usually is a loan, and it's concessionary. It is a below market rate loan, and it is designed specifically to drive impact. This has traditionally been used a lot for land purchases and other kind of land conservation activities, but increasingly foundations are using it for other related conservation activities, using that below market rate of return, which is much better than the negative 100% return of a grant, and to really drive impact. If you are working with a foundation on a PRI, as they are called, There is some paperwork they need to document that this is a loan that has an impact focus similar to their grant dollars, because this is counted in their 5% allocation. But the foundation has this other 95% of their assets, and traditionally, until about 10 years or so ago, most foundations or most foundation program officers and the like kind of ignored that 95%. That money was managed by completely separate entities that were just focused on financial return, and they are mandated to manage that money for financial return. Increasingly, over the last decade or so, the impact-focused staff of foundations is starting to look at that 95% of the corpus of the foundation. And the first step in that has been what they call an ESG screen. So screening your investments for environmental, social, or governance factors. The kind of traditional ones of those are sin stocks, getting out of alcohol, tobacco, firearms, et cetera. Increasingly, foundations are divesting from climate-related stocks and other investments. But the foundation can do a lot more than that, not just saying no to bad investments, but saying yes to good investments. And increasingly, foundations are looking at what's called mission-related investments, or MRIs, which are market rate investments aligned with their impact mission. As I said, often in foundations, kind of structurally, someone other than the impact grant officers are managing that money. And so there has been a bit of a culture shift internally to start looking at that 95% as something they can drive impact with. They do have to be careful about how they invest. These tend to be more equity investments or market rate loans, but with equity investments, the risk factor, it may have a potential of a market rate return, but what is really investing for returns when it comes to risk? The IRS has put out a ruling that says that they can consider riskier investments if they're aligned with their mission, but it has been slow to move that way. But it is increasingly, foundations are looking at those mission-related investments. In addition, one other trend that we're starting to see, and I will confess this, I'm not a deep expert in this, but there is something called recoverable grants that are increasingly being used. Recoverable grants isn't something that's covered in any IRS code, but it is essentially a grant. It's booked on the ledgers as a grant, but in the grant agreement, there is an agreement that that money would be returned if certain milestones are met. And this is essentially a way to enable a program-related investment type investment for more of an equity or riskier startup investment. For example, a new entrepreneur that is trying a new effort, a foundation could give them a grant, and then if they make a certain amount of money by a certain amount of time, the agreement is that they would reimburse the foundation. So it becomes a recoverable grant, and that would be essentially a 0% return or some small interest rate. If you're interested in looking at that, I recommend you kind of investigate that further. As I said, I'm not a deep expert in it, but it is increasingly something that we are hearing more and more of. Another trend I wanted to kind of observe is a lot of the new foundations aren't even foundations at all, and Spring Point is a good example of this. Is we are an LLC, and our donors, when they looked to drive impact, as they were interested in blending grant making and impact investing, they wanted to avoid some of those legal restrictions I just described and those IRS restrictions on how foundations' money can be invested. And so rather than creating a foundation with that tax benefit right up front, they created an LLC, and the tax benefit comes as for every grant, you get a tax deduction, just like you and I, when we write a grant, would have a tax deduction. This gives the entity a lot more flexibility on investment. We don't have to document the mission impact of a program-related investment. We don't have to demonstrate that we are managing impact, managing for returns with mission-related investments. So a lot more flexibility.
Margaret, I'm just chiming in with your 2-minute warning. Thanks.
Thanks, Leigh. The flip side is we are a bit more restricted on grants because we are an LLC and we must give, for example, to 501c3 organizations. But increasingly, we are seeing more entities like this Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, Emerson Collaborative, Omidyar Group, and others. These are some of the new big philanthropic entities are LLC, social impact ventures. Another trend I just want to mention briefly in my last minute or so are donor-advised funds. And these are essentially mini foundations. You can start a donor-advised fund at a financial institution with, you know, a couple $1,000s. You get the tax write-off as soon as you donate it, and then you recommend grants out of that donor-advised fund. And the financial institution miraculously follows your lead and enables you to kind of extend the giving while having the tax benefit up front. There's roughly $121 billion across the country that are in donor-advised funds around the country, in Fidelity and some of these other entities. Some of these donor-advised funds now are looking at using recoverable grant structures to enable impact investing out of those donor-advised funds as well. This is new. There's an entity called CapShift that is trying to set this up, and others, but that is tapping into a large reservoir of resources that right now is often sitting there and could be used for higher risk impact-related investments. And with that, I think I'm pretty much at time, and I'll wrap up.
Thanks, Margaret. Look forward to bringing you back as well. So now we're going to pivot over to Colorado. And Mark, if you're with us, great. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Leigh, Allegra. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Heller with this fantastically acronymized name. And I'm going to talk about bond financing of land conservation. I'm going to try to pack a lot of information into this in my 10 minutes. So hold on. All right. Next slide, Allegra. So I'm going to talk about tax-exempt bond basics, a little bit about my organization, and then a little bit about how SECFA has partnered with the Nature Conservancy to finance many of its land acquisitions. And then I have 4 ideas on how we can do all this in a more organized and productive way. Next slide. So a little bit about tax-exempt bond basics. So exciting. But if you're going to borrow money, often tax-exempt bonds are the cheapest form of borrowing. And as all interest rates go lower, so will the rates for tax-exempt bonds. The reason why tax-exempt bonds are a cheap form of borrowing is because the investor, the lender, the entity that buys our bonds and charges the borrower interest on those bonds, on that loan, they don't have to pay federal or state income tax on the interest revenue that they receive. So because they don't have to pay Uncle Sam, they can offer a lower rate to the ultimate borrower, the land conservation charity in this case. Our money, our funds can only be used for capital projects, including refinancing, and not operations. So if you want to buy land, if you want to buy buildings, and all the attendant professionals that may be involved in those kinds of financings, that's what our money can be used for. Next slide. So I'm going to try to describe this simultaneous transaction. SECFA is the conduit issuer in the upper right. The charity, hopefully most of you all, would be the bottom center. And then the banker investors, perhaps Margaret with Spring Point, would be the purchase of our bonds. And so the conduit issuer sends bonds to the left to the bank or the investor, who then sends money, technically, back to SECFA. And then SECFA unloads its obligation to repay the bank and everything else to the charity, who then has kind of a direct relationship with the banker or investor. It's a three-way simultaneous closing. At the end of the day, the charity has the loan relationship with the banker investor and will make payments according to however they negotiated it, much like any other loan. Next slide, please. So the reason why SECFA gets involved in these kinds of things is that charities, 501c3s, unlike a local government, need somebody like us to issue bonds. Any other local, state, or federal government can issue bonds all by themselves. You see those elections. Will talked about some of those elections, but charities need somebody else to access the bond market. And for Colorado, we are the entity designated by our legislature to issue bonds just for cultural and educational charities. And we can do that nationwide as long as there is some sort of Colorado nexus. And I'll talk about the Nature Conservancy's projects as a way to illustrate that. Next slide, please. So why am I talking to this group from across the country about cultural and educational bond financing? The reason is that in our statute, cultural and educational are defined pretty broadly. For example, we can finance Olympic facilities, we can finance scientific facilities, we can finance land conservation charities if there is a significant kind of built-in cultural or educational component to their work. And oftentimes that does exist. Not always, but often. There might be, oftentimes I should say, there is not a Colorado nexus for an out-of-state charity that we could help with. But other states have conduit issuers just like SECFA, and I'd be happy to connect you to those if you would like that. Next slide. All right, so here's how SECFA and TNC has partnered 6 times over the last couple decades with more than $550 million issued in combined taxable and tax-exempt bonds. And that's a point to make there too. If you have a tax-exempt bond, similar to what Margaret was talking about in Spring Point, there are federal strings attached to tax-exempt bonds that aren't attached to taxable bonds. Taxable bonds don't have quite as low of an interest rate, but they also have no strings attached by the federal government anyway. So let's dig in a little bit more to the TNC example. So for taxable bonds, over $250 million issued in a dozen states or so. In Colorado, that money went to help create the great sand dunes preserves all around that park. Many hectares of land have been preserved around the Great Sand Dunes Park. And also that went to finance the Colorado headquarters. But as you can see, out of this 50-state nation, we have a lot more potential. Next slide. And for tax-exempt bonds, similar, bigger states, maybe not as quite the smaller ones in the Northeast, but still, we've got most of the country yet to work with on TNC. We helped finance the global headquarters in Alexandria. So those projects, here, go back a little bit, Allegra one, thanks. So these projects are sometimes financed exclusively by or for TNC with TNC's money. Sometimes TNC has partnered with other groups like TPL. Sometimes they get public money. Sometimes they get private money. Very much like private real estate developments, there's a capital stack to how these things get put together. and bond money can be layered in with public money and private investment as well. All right, next slide, please. So I've got 4 ideas that I'd like to share with you all today. One is to amplify this partnership into a deliberate national program. This can be done with TNC, as I talked to that group about a couple months ago. But I suspect that on the Zoom call today, there are many charities that work either nationally, regionally, which is what we would need in order to participate from Colorado. If we created a national program where SECFA was the issuer, where we develop a kind of a cadre of banks, investors, financial advisors, and all of those people understand how these conservation deals work and why they should be invested in. That kind of support, that kind of institutional knowledge and teamwork creates efficiencies that will make these deals go faster and cheaper and just much easier, all of which will drive down costs to the ultimate charity, which will allow more money to flow through the conservation projects themselves. We have done this a number of different times. We are launching a new program right now, actually, for public TV and radio stations across the country. Just by way of example, it's kind of a strange industry. If we can teach banks, investors, bond attorneys, how that industry works, then as each new station needs some new financing, we don't have to explain the whole thing all over again. And it will go quicker. Hello, Leigh.
Mark, 2 minutes, thanks.
All right, next slide, please. Major donors can also be bondholders. And I think Margaret mentioned this. If a major donor is going to give $1 million as a charitable donation, they might give even more if they can earn a little bit of money back. That's my own time of going. And so that needs to be evaluated against the charitable deductions that they might otherwise get. Next slide. Smaller bond investors could also be an option. This is an awful graphic, but it represents Fisher's Peak, which is a new TNC acquisition. This would be a way of reaching out to your members on a smaller level, where they could actually buy bonds with a direct connection to the parcel that has kind of an emotional pull to that member. Kind of a marketing scheme, but could be effective. And next slide. And then again, we can create a social impact fund that is bond financed, that could be quite large and then quite flexible, so that all projects that would be financed by it would have to meet pre-established criteria, but having met those criteria, that impact fund could be much more nimble in how it doles out the money. So those are my 4 ideas, and I think my next slide has my name, email, and phone number. I can add that to the chat afterward. I'll be on for the rest of the presentation and available anytime you want to email me. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. You got me good with your why is Mark here slide. Goodness, I was on mute. All right, do we have a Peter Howell on the line?
We do.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Take it away.
Okay. So I'd like, first off, Peter Howell. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Open Space Institute. We're a land conservation organization. We protect land through acquisition. We also help finance efforts and are involved in a fair amount of applied research. We focus a great deal on public access, but also on climate and water. What I'd like to do today is to give you some broad context about water funds, drill a little more deeply into a fund that OSI is involved in, I think I've started my video, okay, is involved in the main Sebago watershed, and then reflect a bit about the role of philanthropy in this space. So I want to acknowledge at the outset OSI's many partners in the Sebago, including importantly Highstead, which some of you may know, which is a group working in the Northeast, and they develop many of the slides here that are part of our collective work in the region. So water funds are a pretty simple idea. It's designed around protecting lands upstream, forest land upstream, to ensure water quality downstream. That's one of the principal goals of funds. Funds also are interested in quantity, so maintaining regular flows during the year, and a suite of co-benefits like biodiversity, wildlife, or even recreation. The precondition of these funds is that there be an intact ecosystem in the upper watershed that is currently providing clean water, that users downstream have adequate funds and willingness to pay for those services, and that's a big one, and that there be sellers, landowners in the upper watershed that will benefit from providing these services by protecting or improving management of their lands. So water funds often have a couple of different objectives. They might be trying to avoid costs, to reduce risk, to avoid regulation, or to anticipate regulation. And sometimes they're motivated by a conservation ethic among landowners in the upper watershed that just think protecting land is the right thing. So there are, oh, I'm sorry, you should be advancing a slide there. This is how water funds work. Excuse me, the next slide, please. These are the funds that exist across the country. There are some 25 of them. And they really range. Some are very informal, others more regulatorily driven. 12, importantly, have dedicated funding where there's a portion of a ratepayer's water bill that is earmarked for protection of land, typically easements in the upper watershed. Slide, please. So water funds exist in different stages of development, I'm going to talk principally about, next slide, a water fund that is actually in an early stage of development or in planning, and this is the Sebago Clean Waters Fund. This is a partnership of a number of organizations, including the Portland Water Authority, the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, a series of regional land trusts in Maine, as well as OSI. Next slide. Next slide. There you go. So the Water Fund was really prompted by Forests on the Edge, which was a landmark analysis of the benefits of private forest land, including timber, wildlife, and water, and the threats that they face. You're looking at one slide looking at clean water. The blue denotes areas that are producing clean water in abundance, and that includes the Sebago. Next slide. So the Sebago is about a 230,000 acre region, supplies 1/6 of the water supplies in Maine. There is currently a filtration avoidance waiver, which means that the city is able to use other measures than filtration, green, natural measures to avoid a regulatory action. Importantly, and this is a number to remember, 84% of this watershed is forested. It's predominantly privately owned, great cold water fisheries. The Portland Water Authority on its own is earmarking about a fair amount of money, increasing amount of money for easements in the upper watershed, and they typically will fund 25% of the cost of an easement. Next slide. So the Water Authority is a real champion. This is Paul Hunt, who has been the real cheerleader and champion for the idea of protecting forests as a way to use green infrastructure, not gray. Next slide. And one thing I do want to mention is that someone on the phone today, Brad Gentry, wrote a terrific book that focused on, actually it had a catchy title, but that focused on water delivery, drinking water systems, and has a great chapter called From Green and Gray that looks and compares the different ways to ensure water quality. So in developing a water fund, you need to look at the needs of multiple stakeholders. There's a fair amount of economics and obviously science involved. One thing I want to point out about the Sebago is there's no looming crisis. The forests are in good shape. There's no major policy mechanism compelling action yet. There's a filtration avoidance waiver, but not a TMDL, a requirement that they remediate. And you have a utility that really kind of gets it and is paying. And the thesis here of this fund is really based on avoided costs. Slide, please. So I don't want you to focus too much on this, but it's really the one on the left, percent forest. OSI did a fair amount of analysis looking at the literature on what are the thresholds in different landscapes when water quality starts to decline. And what you find on forests is it declines really around 65 to 80%, depending on the place, is when water quality declines. And so we're really looking at what would happen if the watershed goes from 84% forested to something lower. Next slide. We did a fair amount of analysis looking at forests and which were threatened, which are producing clean water and which are threatened. We scored them and done a whole sort of prioritization model of which are those forests most important to protect. Next slide. Don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a conceptual analysis looking at if we spent the money to do filtration with gray infrastructure on the right, 155 million, to keep the forests protected as they are, how would that compare with green measures that include reforestation, easements? And that total cost, total green as you see, would be about 44 million. So there's a huge delta there that we're trying to get at here. Next slide. Don't want to spend too much time on this, so you can skip this. We just did an ecosystem service, and you can skip this one as well. This is really the money punch. We tried to model what would happen if there was, in the best case, only a 1% decline in forest, or if there was an 8%. An 8% would take us from 84% down to 78 at a point at which we start to get concerned about degradation of water quality. Next slide. So the money punch here is that if we basically compared what would happen if we had to resort, if we lost all those forest land and we had to filtrate and we spent all that money, it would be about $150 million a year. Capital with 2 million operating, 13 million a year capital. We discount that back and we looked at basically a $38 million sort of annual increase that is the figure on the far right. And then we calculated among water users, how much would their bills go up? So if you look at the top, basically the top 10, their bills would not increase 84%. That's incorrect. They would actually increase 92%, from 1.9 million to 3.8 million. That's the first line in that red box. So that's a significant increase, and that's what we're trying to use to get folks' attention. Next slide.
2 minutes, Peter. Thanks.
So basically our pitch is that if we lose 8% of the forest, that could trigger a huge increase in pollution, and it would require a big plant filtration, and the water rates for the biggest users could go up 92%. And the idea is, could we invest 10% of the savings, of the difference between gray and green, in a water fund that could help us keep the land and the forest land protected at that higher percentage? So we've developed a business case, done a fair amount of outreach. Next slide. The Sebago Clean Waters, next slide. And we're in discussions with several large water users, for example, a medical center, Texas Instruments, and other bigger users to invest in the fund. The challenge, of course, is what's their incentive? It's basically the fund would help prevent an outcome that is speculative and potentially far off. That is, conversion of 8% or loss of 8% of the forest. And so you have kind of a free rider problem in the sense that right now they're paying pretty low rates. And what we're asking them to do is to buy an insurance policy against a potential future decline. And some of them might say, well, shouldn't rates and regulations solve this problem? And it could, but we're suggesting a more efficient way may be a voluntary program that forestalls a much worse potential outcome. But it's a sell, and it's going to take some work. Next slide. So we've got the breweries involved because they get it. Clean water in the Sebago and forests, they get that connection intuitively. Next slide. We've got some early adopters. The U.S. Endowment has invested some early money in this effort. We've gotten support from NRCS. We've applied for an RCPP grant, which is to the Department of Agriculture. Next slide. But here are some thoughts. We're on the cusp of attracting some major philanthropy. We've gotten good news from one for a very large commitment. But philanthropy can help in a couple ways. It can support the R&D of the science and some of the economic modeling to establish enabling conditions. It can help strengthen the capacity of players. One foundation has helped strengthen some of the regional land trusts to get them poised to step up and accelerate their land protection. There's a big room for PRIs, revolving loan funds, and as Margaret mentioned, and various other kinds of creative ways to use philanthropy, a loan loss reserve, or sweetening the interest rates, or providing guarantees to make available more flexible funding up front that can be used to purchase the land. Also, there's room for impact investments, but that's probably another webinar. Last slide, please. So the takeaway is, if you're trying to do something like this, and we've been at it for a year or two now, is do your homework, do the analysis. What's the driver for change? Where's the leverage, and what is your niche? Get funders in early if possible. It's really important for a funder to understand if they can help shape something early on by funding some of the science or economics. You get that right, and you bring them in, and you get them invested for when you may need them for a bigger investment. But be flexible, things change. There's a lot that's changed in our own program. Finding the right fit, I think, is really important, and finding the right rationale for your fund. Is it about risk reduction? Is it about forestalling regulation? Is it responding to regulation? One thing I've learned with philanthropy too is don't oversell. And that's related to the last point. Everything takes longer than you think when you try to pull off these kinds of mechanisms. And we've learned patience and humility in the process, and not overselling about what you can do next year when in fact it may not happen until the year after or the year after that is a good lesson to learn. So thank you. I think that's all I have.
Thanks, Peter. And we are going to transition right into Alison's presentation before bringing all of our panelists back. So Alison, I'm going to hand the reins over to you.
Great. Thanks, Leigh, and thanks everyone else involved in the webinar, Allegra, Amy, everyone with logistics. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Alison Souders. I work for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund at EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., also known as the CWSRF. So next slide, please. So what is the CWSRF? Put simply, we're an environmental bank that provides low-cost sources of financing for a wide range of water quality projects. The fund is administered by the US EPA and state agencies. If you look at this diagram, the arrows show the flow of funds. The fund is administered by, the EPA awards capitalization grants each year to each state program. 50 states and Puerto Rico each have a CWSRF state program in Puerto Rico. With these funds, the state programs make low interest loans to eligible assistance recipients. Many states also choose to leverage their programs by going to the bond market. Principal repayments and interest earnings are recycled back into individual SRF programs to finance new projects, allowing the funds to revolve. Next slide. This is just another graphic showing the federal and state contributions to the programs. EPA provides the capitalization grant each year, and the states provide 20% match. Next slide. So the SRFs are state implemented and operated programs with a wide range of flexibility. They can set specific loan terms up to 30 years. They can set specific loan terms, including interest rates from 0% to market rate and repayment terms up to 30 years. And some states offer longer repayment periods. States also determine eligible borrowers and are responsible for selecting and funding projects with flexibility to target resources. Next slide. So something within the CWSRF program is additional subsidization. This additional subsidization provides even greater savings to communities by providing a percentage of the capitalization grant in the form of principal forgiveness, negative interest loans, and grants. The subsidy is targeted towards communities that have difficulty financing projects. The amount of funding available is between 0 to 30% each year, depending on the amount of the appropriation. Each state determines how they apply the additional subsidy and in what amount. Next slide. So oftentimes CWSRF borrowers are utilities that have revenue streams or rates that they can use to pay off their loans. The CWSRF, the borrowers must identify a dedicated repayment source before a loan is approved, but the repayment source does not have to come from the project itself. Conservation projects often have a hard time repaying a loan and might be used to grants, but we've seen a lot of borrowers with innovative repayment sources. Some folks have used stormwater district fees, farming revenues, hunting license sales, and timber harvest revenues. Actually, in the picture here, the Yurok tribe in California, they had used carbon offset revenues to repay a 0% loan, 0% interest loan for $18.8 million to purchase over 22,000 acres in California. Next slide. So here is a list of the 12 statutory project eligibilities in the Clean Water Act. These include the construction of publicly owned treatment works, the implementation of a state non-point source management plan, decentralized systems like septics, stormwater management, and land conservation. The SRF can fund capital projects as well as planning and design. However, we're not able to fund ongoing operations and maintenance. Next slide. So a lot of times folks don't even know that the CWSRF can fund anything other than treatment plants or municipalities. So here are just some of the project categories that might be lesser known. We can really finance a broad range of water quality improvement projects, not just gray infrastructure. In the case of land conservation, we can finance lease, fee simple purchase, or conservation easements. Next slide. So eligibility varies by state and project type. Potential SRF borrowers must meet certain criteria to be eligible to apply for assistance. Most SRF programs may provide assistance to public, private, or nonprofit entities for water quality projects. Eligible recipients vary by project type and include municipalities, utilities, state agencies, community groups, farmers, conservation districts, and nonprofits, among more. Next slide. So just to give everyone a feel of the SRF program and how much money is available, over the life of the program, the CWSRF has provided over $138 billion in assistance to projects. Annual funding over the last few years has been over $6 billion. The majority of this funding has been provided to traditional wastewater infrastructure projects, but we at EPA headquarters have been really supportive and encouraging states to provide them and providing them technical assistance to find ways to finance what some may call non-traditional projects, which land conservation or green infrastructure would fall under. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some challenges to providing, there are some challenges for borrowers that are land conservation oriented or non-point source, watershed protection. There's several obstacles, including identifying a repayment source. Some states have restrictions on who they can lend to or certain financing types that aren't possible because of statutory requirements. And of course, capacity constraints at state agencies can become an issue. Next slide. So this is just one of the innovative financing mechanisms that states have come up with to kind of bypass some of those obstacles. Sponsorship lending is something that we're really pushing at headquarters for states to look into to finance projects that don't have a revenue stream and therefore have problems repaying their loan and otherwise might not be able to get them. Sponsorship lending, it bundles a treatment works project with a non-point source project in the same loan agreement. The sponsor receives a loan with a reduced interest rate as compensation for also taking on a non-point source project, allowing municipalities to address their needs without placing repayment responsibility on the non-point source project. Next slide. So this is just an example from Ohio's sponsorship program. They were the first state to start sponsorship, and they provide $15 million a year dedicated to that program. And they're specifically focused on land conservation. In this example, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District received a reduced interest rate to sponsor the acquisition of 87 acres of high quality marshland. It also sponsored 3 other projects, and these are happening all over the state in Ohio. They've been a real model for other states. I'll probably just go quickly through the next two. Next slide. This is just, you can go back one. Thanks. This is just another example of an innovative financing mechanism that has been used to reach borrowers that otherwise would be difficult to reach. Linked deposit capitalizes on the fact that CWSRF funds can earn interest. With linked deposit, a state CWSRF program purchases a reduced rate CD from a private financial institution, it's usually a local bank, and then loans out the deposited funds at a slightly lower interest rate to individuals for smaller water quality projects. Next slide. So this is just an example. This is an example of livestock, but it could be used for other sorts of project types. Iowa provides 3% loans to small farmers through local banks, which is really great. A benefit is that the farmers and individual borrowers on the end are able to work with their local bank, and the CWSRF does not have to administer the program.
Alison, friendly 2 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks. And there are many other innovative financing mechanisms that states have come up with to finance these types of projects. Next slide. So there is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and our counterparts at the EPA is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Though they have much different requirements than us, and they can only lend to public water supplies, public water suppliers. The AWIA, American Water Infrastructure Act of 2019, actually greatly broadened their eligibility in their set-asides, which are chunks of cash that they put aside for certain types of projects or maybe for staff. So their local assistance set-aside actually has received changes that allows for source water protection and capacity development activities. Next slide. So this is actually a really cool example. I hope we see more things like this. The DWSRF provided a grant using these new eligibilities from AWIA. They provided the grant to do the property value appraisal of this land in Washington in Skagit County, and the CWSRF, and they use that to kind of go to the community and drum up interest and get support. And then the CWSRF followed up with a loan to purchase the land, and that had a 50% loan forgiveness, which acts like a grant, but gets around the federal grant requirements. Next slide. This is probably the first reading I would suggest to go take a look at. This is 2017 report on innovative financing mechanisms. I only talked about sponsorship and linked deposit, but there's several others that would pertain to the audience here within this. And I provided links on the last slide, but I know that this will be in webinar, so you can go ahead and email me if you would like anything or have any questions. Can you please just go back to the last one with next steps? So as I mentioned, the CWSRF and DWSRFs are state implemented and operated. So that means each state has an SRF. The CWSRF and DWSRF might not be called that within your state, and they might be housed in different agencies, which also complicates things. But for next steps, if you're interested in federal financing for land conservation, I would reach out to your state or to your state CWSRF or drinking water SRF programs. I would encourage them to fund watershed protection projects and land conservation, and to look into innovative financing mechanisms that you've heard today, or really anything. We're open to questions. That's all. So you could just show the resources, and then that's it. Thank you.
Thanks,
my contact
Alison.
information is on the last page, actually. Very last. There it is. Yeah, so feel free to let me know if you have any questions, anyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And we're going to invite our other panelists to turn their videos back on. We're going to give folks just a second here. And Alison, I thought since we've been learning about the SRF program from you most recently, we can maybe start by digging in there. And this also buys our listeners a little time to heat up the chat box with their questions, but also gives us a chance to revisit some of the content and resources that were presented and offered by our panelists. So Alison, we were talking in prep a bit, and I just wonder, in terms of the trends that you're paying attention to at the state level, what's kind of sticking out at the moment?
The trends at the state level, it does really vary by state, but since the Water Resources Reform and Development Act in 2014, that was what actually broadened our eligibilities from 3 to 11, and then 1 added since then. So I think a lot of the states are trying to figure out ways to finance these projects. Some have hard times because of capacity or just being used to financing great infrastructure and those borrowers coming in. And on the flip side, a lot of borrowers don't know that the SRF can finance their projects, so they're not coming to the SRFs. So the states and us are trying to promote people coming in and ask questions and work that way.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, but also a little bit just airing into the territory of different federal agency priorities. I think that you've been seeing some real alignment between the goals of SRF with other agency priorities. And I wonder if you could just speak to that for a moment.
Well, a recent development was the American Water Infrastructures Act actually offered a large amount of money, I can't remember the amount, to USDA for source water protection activities. And a great aspect of the program is the fact that we are able to leverage ourselves with other government organizations or private stakeholders. I forgot to mention that we can provide grant match as well. So there have been times where we work with USDA and we've been trying to figure out a lot of their money doesn't come for a little bit after. So in some cases, the SRF has been providing bridge loans where you don't get your grant yet, but you can provide the money up front from the SRF and then pay it back when you get the grant. So it's just been kind of trying to work those type of things out.
Wonderful. I imagine we'll have a couple inbound questions to really suss out the full suite of opportunities and connections there. And pivoting over to Mark, if I can pick on you, Mark, you kind of stole my thunder on why the heck a Health and Education Finance Authority is issuing bonds for conservation, but we've had a couple questions come through and I'll piggyback on those. You know, can you just speak to some of the ways in which the Colorado connection has been made, whether for the TNC World Headquarters or for other projects, other land conservation projects, particularly taking place in other states?
Sure. You know, we haven't done very much conservation work at all. So far, it's just with the Nature Conservancy. Love to do more. But for TNC, the fact that they even do projects in Colorado probably establishes enough of a nexus. And then us actually participating in some of those transactions really solidifies that nexus. If there is any other organization, national or regional, that does work in Colorado, similar, that would probably establish all the nexus we need. If there was some sort of broader social impact fund that would involve multiple land conservation charities, that if those charities operated through some sort of organized network, then likely the lawyers would have to give the final word on this. If that consortium did one project in Colorado, that would probably be enough of a nexus for us to issue bonds elsewhere. And then for a conservation charity to have an educational or cultural project element to it isn't all that hard. If the land to be conserved has some sort of historical or cultural significance, if it is part of a research project, that would qualify. If the conserved property hosts field trips, congressional delegations, if it can be used in any way for education, and not on a one-off kind of way. It's got to be an organized part of the programming, then that would qualify as well. So the nexus and the cultural and educational definitions are all fairly easy thresholds to meet.
Thanks, Mark. Incredibly broad. Wow.
Yeah, it can be.
And Margaret, if I can pivot over to you, I think, speaking of someone who's always in the grant-seeking position, there's a bit of a power dynamic that's inherent to a lot of our relationships to foundations. And I just wonder, kind of for your insight or words of wisdom on how to initiate a conversation with a foundation program officer or contact about the potential for support outside of traditional gifts or grants.
Good question, and I think that power dynamic is real, and it's something that we at SpringPoint spend a lot of time trying to neutralize and even reverse. I think the biggest recommendation is don't be afraid to ask questions, and I think a lot of foundations are eager to learn what the interest is out there, and just because something isn't advertised on their website, they may be thinking about doing these new, more innovative approaches with their resources. So I would ask, and entering into a discussion with a foundation, asking for information instead of money is always a good way of entering a discussion. I'm just trying to learn, is this something you do, or do you know others that are doing this? Becomes a way of building a relationship before you are, putting the ask in front of them. So I would say be fearless, ask questions, develop relationships. It's kind of like in your personal life too.
Sage counsel for all of us to pay attention to there for sure. And now, Will, if I could pivot over to you. I know we had a little dialogue around this and some really intriguing learning coming from it, but given the current moment, both in terms of social and racial issues and certainly the pandemic of COVID-19, how have you seen public interest or opinion shifting in its relation to park and open space?
Yeah, great question, Leigh. And I think we probably all experienced this as we've gone through quarantine or stay at home or shelter in place, what have you, in different parts of the country. But American voters are coming to realize the importance of parks and trails in a way that perhaps they haven't in the past, because it's given us all an opportunity to during the pandemic to get outside and to exercise and to help our mental health as well. And that's an argument in recent polling that we're seeing is very compelling to voters. So whereas traditionally issues around clean water and protecting wildlife habitat were perhaps more important to voters than access to close to home recreational opportunities, we're seeing that issue of having a place close by that you can get outside and get some fresh air and do so safely and according to the CDC guidelines. And I think that also raises a real equity issue because like so many other issues in our country during the pandemic, it's pointed out those neighborhoods that have access to parks in this case and those neighborhoods that don't, and really puts the onus on us and the conservation community to make sure that all Americans can enjoy those kind of benefits.
Yeah, well stated. All right, Peter, you're up. My question for you.
Yep, I see him.
So,
good question.
I think in terms of initiating and driving forward a watershed scale initiative, especially based on kind of speculative future declines in water quality, no small investment of time or of effort or of probably blood, sweat, and literal tears. But I wonder if there's a point at which you've observed in the Sebago Clean Waters, you start to get to that groundswell, you start to really have the organizational apparatus that can bring in multiple other strategies, approaches, efforts, and types of money. So maybe just my sneaky bend in there is, at what point do you really start to get rewarded for the blood, sweat, and tears with the uptick of momentum?
Well, it's a great question, and I may touch on one other in the process of answering yours, if you'll permit me. I think, momentum is funny. It can come in a lot of different directions. Typically, I think it comes with either funding or key institutional support of some sort. And for us, having the support of the Water Authority, which is incredible. I mean, many locales struggle to get their utilities to understand the connection, or their geographies aren't quite right, or are complicated or too big. The Sebago is perfectly sized in the sense that the Water Authority gets it. It's the upper watershed is not so far away. So that's been a real sort of validator. But the real proof of concept and momentum, I think, will come when we get an actual investment from a large water user. I say investment, it's going to be more of a charitable donation, but because it's not structured as an equity investment. So I use that word liberally. I think when a big user or when a big foundation steps forward, or not even a big, but a small foundation with a big commitment. And we're very close to that. But I think it's when the water users will get over the hump of saying, well, aren't I already giving at the office? And that's a challenge. Now, I want to respond to one other question, if you'd let me, which is, there's a good question about carbon credits, because it's a long time to wait, as was phrased nicely in the question by Greg, about waiting for this insurance policy to sink in. Aren't there ways to derive revenue by other means? So two of the slides I didn't show, or showed too quickly, Greg, were designed to get at the suite of other ecosystem services, one of which is carbon, which actually can return money to the landowner, which of course is essential, because to have a selling landowner, you need a landowner who's happy to give up something. So carbon credits can absolutely play that role. There is a proposal underway right now to develop carbon credits in the Delaware, a place where we also work, but I think it's absolutely applicable in the Sebago. There's smaller ownerships, and the big challenge with the carbon program, as some of you may know, is you've got to get to some scale to cover all the upfront costs designed to do carbon verification, FSC certification, and that's typically around $1,500 or $2,000. So we have some challenges. We'd have to do some aggregation, but in a watershed where you have larger forested ownerships, carbon credits are a great way to go. And it's a good question.
All right, Brad, we've invited you on to perceive of any curiosities our audience members may have, or things that we've kind of glossed over, but should probably make more explicit in terms of dynamics.
I was curious about one thing that Alison mentioned, and she was sort of surprised when she was talked about, or appeared to be, of the clean water portion of the SRF working with the drinking water portion of the SRF. You think about the variety of co-benefits associated with natural areas. We've heard about water and climate and health and others. I'm just curious if people are seeing different parts of governments or different parts of foundations coming together, crossing their silos more actively these days to support through shared funding these kinds of initiatives.
Who wants to take a stab at it?
Well, from the federal point of view, we've been getting a lot of back and forth with the USDA, NRCS, and the Forest Service are really ramping up. They've got a lot of money in this new, with the OEA Act. And we've actually, within EPA, we've been trying to kind of figure out the different funding sources and how we can work together. Like I mentioned, the 319 non-point source program does some of this work, but often they can't reach many people because they don't have a lot of money. So we've been trying to work with them to talk about across the country how we can help each other.
And I would just respond, if I could, Brad, if Congress approves full and permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that's going to radically increase federal funding for conservation, and I think open up a lot more partnerships between federal agencies, state agencies, and local governments, particularly in that the stateside funding under LWCF. That's a huge opportunity that's before us.
And I would just say that at the municipal level, there's important opportunities for different municipal government entities to work together. Parks Department and the Water Department working together on a green infrastructure installation, or the Department of Transportation coordinating on stormwater issues as well. That happens a fair amount. It could happen a lot more, but I think that, the smaller the entity, the easier often that partnership happens. And there needs to be a real expansion there, but there's a lot more there than we think.
Final word there, anyone else? I know one pilot that, Margaret, you might have been alluding to is the Joint Benefit Authority in San Francisco, combining urban park access with traffic calming measures with green stormwater infrastructure. It is a pilot, but it's certainly something that we're kind of cheering on from the sidelines. Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you to the panel. We've got a few minutes here and a lot of questions coming through, some of which have already been answered in kind of chat form, but I'll just kind of pick along those that have been flagged here. Will, you already answered this one to the questioner, but I think some other folks may have curiosity. On average, what does a county measure initiative, including feasibility research, advertising, surveys, et cetera, cost to get to the polls?
Yeah, so those first 4 steps I talked about, the ballot measure design, including feasibility research, polling, program recommendations, and ballot language in round numbers at the county level is about 50 to 75,000. So not a huge number. When you get to the campaign, it's very difficult to estimate, and I really don't offer guesses about how much a campaign would cost. There's so many different variables in that, including election timing. Are you going to be on to the presidential election this November, where lots of people are voting, or in perhaps a smaller turnout? Special election or primary election, what level of support does a measure have from our polling? Will there be organized paid opposition? And will there be any competing ballot measures? Without knowing those things, it's really difficult to estimate the cost of a campaign at the county level.
That's an extremely eloquent it depends response. Thanks, Will. Question for Peter. How would a water fund potentially work for aquifer protection?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know exactly. I don't work enough in the West where aquifers predominate. I'm a little, in my recent life, I'm too Eastern focused, but I don't know, maybe Margaret, who's done a little bit of work in the West herself, might have a thought on that. Sorry to throw it to you, Margaret.
I have not seen an explicit aquifer protection water fund, although, the line between forest conservation and aquifer conservation is pretty thin. Preserving the forest is recharging the aquifer often. I think the key is a well-delineated aquifer and a clear connection downstream. I know there have been efforts, but I have not seen one fully completed.
Yeah, aquifer is just a more complicated system because it's low down, and understanding how it gets recharged and what limits its recharge. It's not as simple as a surface water drinking system, which is what we're dealing with in the Sebago. But I do know from work with the Trust for Public Land a long time ago when I was in the funding world that in Texas, they have done some work trying to protect areas around aquifers. So there is a connection. It's just not quite as strong as in a sort of surface water system. And that's just a...
And my experience with water funds is that the more difficult that connection, but people in a lot of ways get it, that there's not the scientific evidence. So it's not a, acre foot for acre foot protection, but there is the concept that you preserve the land around an aquifer, you preserve those headwaters that are recharging your aquifer driven water, you're going to get conservation, but trying to demonstrate it at a scientific level is often harder.
Right. Leigh, panelist question. There's so many great questions I'm trying to respond to, and I'm a little distracted. Are they still going to be there after we go off?
Yeah, so we'll still have the chat and fair game to follow up on any of the questions individually. We can even allocate them if we feel so inclined. But I do have a question for the panel that came through that I'd love to pose to you all. Frequently, we do talk about models that have proven successful for various funding and financing opportunities. This question speaks to the less than successful, or perhaps defining success in other terms. Are there examples of approaches, perhaps novel approaches, that have not demonstrated proof of concept, that have not proven successful by their own definition, or in some cases may have resulted in some kind of a perverse incentive or outcome? So if anyone's willing to offer up a kind of story or anecdote or example they are in.
Oh my gosh, this could take a long time.
We've got 3 minutes, so have fun.
So I'll give you one example, because from the funding world where I spent a fair amount of time, the Nature Conservancy pioneered one of the most impressive concepts in the Forest Bank, in the Clinch River in southwestern Virginia. And the notion was to aggregate forest land. Landowners deposit essentially the land or the rights to harvest it into the bank. TNC manages it and returns a dividend to the forest land owners from the sustainable harvesting of the land. That's the concept in a nutshell. It failed. It bombed. And the reason it bombed is that TNC was so innovative and ahead of its time in some ways that sort of like life care facilities, 20 or 30 years ago, you get the actuarial you get the actuarial data wrong and you fail miserably, not because it's necessarily a bad concept, but TNC was in early on it. I totally, applaud them. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation lost $1 million loan loss reserve. But it was as we say in the or as people say in the philanthropic world, it was failing forward. It was a really important model. It has led to some terrific work and a revised model in Indiana that TNC has found a way to work by limiting its risk. And it's led to some other terrific innovation by TNC and others. So I take my hat off to them for actually willing to risk something and fail, but failing forward.
We may be out of time to describe other ones, but I would reiterate the ones I've seen that have been unsuccessful was not due to the structure being unsuccessful. It was due to the culture of the parties not being ready for that type of system. And I think a lot of the pay for performance financing structures out there are slow to be adopted, not because they're really a brilliant and the future of a lot of this work, but the government and decision-making systems aren't ready for that approach yet. And I would stress yet.
Well, hey, we've got a couple other questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to, but I hope everyone will join me in a hearty thank you to our panelists. Also to each person who tuned in and stuck with us here to the end of the first session. We are reconvening in an hour for our next session, Conservation Finance Opportunities with Private Capital. So we hope that for our audience, you'll grab a snack, you'll get a quick stretch in, and that you'll return with us in just a bit. But as we sign off here, thank you again to all of our panelists. This has been a really, really great session and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.